Good morning, everybody. This is Marco Marinucci from Mind the Bridge, and today we're going to talk about our new report on the Japanese corporate outpost of innovation in Silicon Valley. So we're going to spend the next hour and a half with a few friends and speakers that I'm going to introduce shortly. But before getting started, maybe a little bit of a context of what we do and why is this report important to us. This was supposed to be clearly an event that we had planned for quite some time, and has turned into an online event. It also gives us the possibility of having a much wider audience and probably even more international than if it had been hosted in our premises in San Francisco. So a couple of words about ourselves. I'm Marco Marinucci, the founder of Mind the Bridge. Mind the Bridge, we are an innovation advisory firm. We've been operating now for 13 years. The headquarters is in San Francisco, but we're actually very international by nature. We have offices in a few places in Europe, and actually even during this craziness of this crisis, we had the opportunity to speed up our opening of the first presence in Asia, of all places, in South Korea. What we do for a living is in an innovation advisory. So we work at an intersection between corporates and startups, typically acting as an extension of the innovation departments or the corporate venture capital of a number of large corporates. One of the things that we do in these activities is really to create ecosystems where startups and corporates can meet. We also concentrate some of these gatherings in what we call scale-up summits that we host pretty much every quarter, every 3 months. The next one is happening in a month, in June, at the end of June, in Israel. The one after this, actually, for the local community here, will be in San Francisco at the end of September, beginning of October. Actually, you can see here a little landing page. So for entities and companies and startups that are interested in interacting and having quality meetings with the specific corporates that can be partners, acquirers, or investors, you're more than welcome to participate. One of the things that we do very often, actually for the last 10 years, is to study the ecosystems of innovation in different factors. So some might be a little bit more transactional. So we publish several reports about the aspects of this integration between corporates and startups. Some, as I mentioned, are more transactional. So for example, we evaluate the latest M&A transactions between corporates and startups and try to make sense of them. Some other reports are more on the macro trends of how corporates are structuring their activities of open innovation, as is being called. And throughout this activity, one of the common practice that is happening in the last few years is really the ability of having outposts of innovations around the world. And that's something that is a trend that we have been following for quite some time, in particular in the places where directly present here in Silicon Valley. And so as part of this activity, the visibility of what the Japanese corporates are doing in Silicon Valley became more and more of a priority. So that's why eventually we spend a good amount of time, not alone, with this process of filtering who is present here. We had the pleasure of working with our partner JETRO, in particular with the office in San Francisco. And so we're going to spend the last few minutes with getting a better understanding of what JETRO does. So let me introduce Noriya Tarutani, the executive director of JETRO San Francisco. Hi, Nori.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Yeah.
We're mentioning.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah.
We're mentioning that it's great to actually see ourselves with shirts. And now we've been in the lockdown here in the Bay Area for quite some time. And so that's really an event like this that can get us back into very, very nice shirts. So, Nori, it's been a pleasure. Again, we've been collaborating now for a few years, and clearly for an activity that is so concentrated with Japan and the tracking of what's happening here, the support to JETRO for us has been central. So maybe for the audience here that is pretty international, let's give a little bit more of a context of what is JETRO as an organization overall.
Yeah, thanks, Marco, for your introduction. I'm Nori Tarutani, Executive Director of Japan External Trade Organization, San Francisco. So what's JETRO? JETRO is a Japan External Trade Organization. We are a government organization that works to promote mutual trade and investment between Japan and the rest of the world. JETRO has an office all over the world. We have 74 offices in 54 countries with 1,600 employees worldwide. In the US, we have 6 offices, including San Francisco and Los Angeles in California. And what we do at JETRO San Francisco here is to support Japanese companies expanding their business in San Francisco Bay Area, as well as helping US companies entering the Japanese market.
I know you're also supporting a lot of startups and, practically speaking, also with the presence in some of the major events where Japanese startups can be showcased, right? Here, not just in Silicon Valley, but also in the major events.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, JETRO recently focused on the startup and innovations. And as I mentioned, we support both ways, helping Japanese startups expanding their business all over the world, as well as helping US startups expand their business into Japan. So let me introduce for Japanese startup support. We are partner with local accelerator, venture capital, and ecosystem builders. We provide various services, including bootcamp and mentoring and introduction to angel, venture capital, or corporate venture capital, or potential clients, as well as incorporation service, including free co-working space. So as Marco mentioned, we also help Japanese startups showcase their technology at the famous exhibitions, including, for example, TechCrunch Disrupt San Francisco and Consumer Electronics in Las Vegas. So usually we support over 200 Japanese startups. 200 Japanese startups uses our service every year. So if you are corporate venture capital, or if you are accelerator, or if you are corporate size, please contact us to get the latest information of Japanese startups.
Very good. Maybe give us a little bit of a history of JETRO in the Bay Area. How long has JETRO been present here in the Bay Area?
Oh, I don't know exactly, but we are founded in 1950 or 1960. But we have been in Bay Area for a long time.
For a long time, yeah. And during this long time, even in the last few years, have you seen? Is your experience of the presence of Japanese corporate activities, have they changed in the last few years? Have you noticed any significant change?
Oh, corporate activity?
Yes.
Yes, recently, actually 10 years ago, the presence was very small. So we do the survey every 2 years. According to our survey, we only had around 500 Japanese companies operating in Bay Area in 2009. However, around 50 companies have been expanding their business every year since 2009. And the latest survey, which was done in 2018, shows we have over 900 Japanese companies in Bay Area, which is almost double the amount from 10 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, and our research team is currently updating this number for 2020, and we haven't finished this research yet. But I'm sure it will surely reach over 1,000 companies in 2020.
Yeah, it is significant, and then we're going to talk about the details of our report. But our report is focusing mostly on the large corporates, actually, just on the very large corporates. But you're mentioning that is a much wider range of companies from Japan, small, medium, and large, that actually landing here.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Actually, the big contributor to this increase, it's not manufacturing office, or it's not sales office, and not startup from Japan. They are mostly innovation outposts and corporate venture capital and innovation lab and LPs from major Japanese companies. And they are all looking to collaborate with US startups. So that's why we are very happy to be involved in this report. because we would like to encourage a US company to contact the Japanese CBC or Japanese innovation lab.
And that's exactly why, thank you for mentioning that. That's exactly why the structure of the report that we're launching today, so you'll find it in a website and in the social, part of it is really done and planned as a who is who, so really a directory of a contact person of the corporates, the major corporates of CVC, so that the local entities here, the local startups interested in collaborating with these corporates that are, as we mentioned, significant, will find a way in, right? So that's one of the major reasons why we're doing this report.
That I would like to add one thing. So the report we launched today includes only 85 Japanese innovation outposts, right? Because we picked up these companies from global Fortune 500. So if we could add all companies operating in Bay Area, I think it will reach to 200. So we want to update this report in the future.
Absolutely.
to invite all companies in Bay Area.
Yeah, and this is, again, those reports are living organism. It's not a static picture. The last thing, and I know it's very early to figure, but do you think that with the current crisis of the coronavirus as it is, would that delay this flow of corporates, or to some extent has that affected much of this flow of I mean, clearly practically on a practical level, it goes without saying, but I guess in part of the planning for medium term, do you see any specific thoughts of what JETRO is doing today?
Oh, good. Yeah, it's good questions. As I mentioned, the presence of Japanese corporate outposts are huge enough, right now. And this report, I think you will probably explain detail about the report later on. But everybody may be surprised that the Japanese CVC deal reached $28 billion in the past 5 years, right? And this increase in investment resulted from the success of the corporate culture shift inside their company. And open innovation requires a different management approach. And they used to face a business culture, challenges between Japanese headquarters and Silicon Valley startup culture. But some Japanese innovation outposts have successfully brought strong decision power from Japanese headquarters to Bay Area, so that they could decide everything here in Bay Area, and they could work with Silicon Valley startups so quickly. So again, your question is what happened after the coronavirus? They already got a lot of big presence in Bay Area, and I don't know how it will change after the coronavirus, but I received a lot of positive feedback from the big Japanese company, and they will continue to be involved to work with startups because they have the decision power. They have a lot of people from Japan to here. So JETRO wants to support all Japanese companies, including CBC or Innovation Lab, to work with US startups.
Thank you, Nori. So appreciate it. Again, thanks for your support and partnership. We're going to continue now and going a little deeper in some of the highlights of the report. And as I mentioned, it's something that you can download from now. I'm going to give you real quick also the links. Then we'll continue. We'll do a very quick break, and we'll continue with an interview with one of the senior executives that have been most active in these trends of corporate and innovation support. Is the CEO of the World Innovation Lab that will start at 10 o'clock. So let's go through real quick to report. Those are some highlights that I'm going to share with you. And then again, I'll leave you with a full copy of the report downloadable here under mindthebridge.com/research. That's where you find all our reports for free, just a PDF version that you can download. A little bit of a history. As I mentioned before, we do research on these macro trends on the different shapes and form. Last September, during our summit, Scale Up Summit that we hosted here at the NASDAQ Entrepreneurship Center, we presented a report that was the focus of the corporate innovation outpost in Silicon Valley from all the major companies. And the major companies, as we mentioned, as Nori mentioned before, for us are a mix of the private and public companies by size, so revenues or market capitalization, from Forbes and Fortune. And that's where eventually prompted a sub-analysis of just the Japanese subset, because from that report that is here on the left, really the highlight, one of the highlights that we discovered was the concentration of and flow of capital that was originated from Japan, and the concentration of outposts from Japanese corporates in the overall range of companies present here. So that's why eventually that prompted a deep dive, and that's where we started working on the current report. A couple of real quick mentions on the framework that we're working around. So as I mentioned before, these studies are focusing on the interaction between startups and corporates. Is something that, especially outside of Silicon Valley, interesting to say, is called open innovation. So open innovation is really the theory and the paradigm that got eventually put in words and in books by Henry Chesborough, one of our mentors as well. Here you see it in one of the events that we hosted not too long ago on the survival of the fittest. And the idea of open innovation is pretty simple, is the fact that innovation and survival of corporates cannot be sustained by internal research and internal R&D, but needs to include also an external path to market, as is mentioned here. And so really all the different interactions with the world of innovators that go from outside. And that can take different shapes and forms. Here we just put a few models as examples of how this interaction eventually can take place, from the right to the left. That might include really at the most advanced level acquisition, so M&A or investment or procurement, so having specific path to integrate activities of a corporate with specific path for startups that might be simplified and much quicker. It can include support to accelerators, or can include stuff as is the focus of this report. So having antennas with the ability to spot the trends, the macro trends are happening in the world of reference, and so having an exposure and trend spotting. And that's essentially what this report is about. So again, to give some boundaries, the focus here is for corporates that, as I mentioned before, are just in the list of 2019, just to give a boundary of the Fortune Global 500 and the Forbes 2000, so the private largest companies by revenue, and the most capitalized companies by Forbes 2000. They need to have a full focus on innovation. So if there is an office that is fully focused on commercialization, for example, that's not of interest of this very report. And also they need to have a full-time presence. Again, so we count entities that are here with an office, with a full-time, at least a full-time person. And this is, again, is a lot of there are a lot of gray areas in this boundary. So here the disclaimer is that clearly this is a report where data is changing on a constant basis. Corporates are moving in and out. They're reorganizing, restructuring themselves. It is actually pretty common. And people that are potential points of contact might change as well. So this is best effort, but I think it's definitely, we've done it in the past, we've been doing it for quite some time. I think it becomes an interesting data point, although is to be updated constantly. But a good data point of what is the picture of the day, in particular when it's compared to the few years before, and potentially looking back in a few years. The second data point is how we eventually categorized those outposts. Again, this is our internal categorization, but just to make sure that we understand the terms as we put it, we basically defined 4 different kinds of outposts of a presence here. And starting from the right-hand side, CVC, corporate venture capital, pretty clear. So it's an entity here fully dedicated to investing. So equity investment into startups where the funding is coming from the headquarters of the corporates. Then we call R&D centers. Again, just to be clear, what that is basically a large in terms of numbers. So we're talking in the hundreds, in the thousands of people fully dedicated to build internal R&D. So having a presence here, a large office where the R&D, the internal R&D of the corporates is also developed, not at the headquarters, but here in Silicon Valley. And then going again from right to left, those are smaller presence. So what we call the Corporate Innovation Lab are small teams whose focus is typically to build the first filter of what is called the POCs, the proof of concepts, with the local startups. So probably 15, 20 people locally here able to select, to scout, and to filter solutions from startups, and able eventually to do some local pre-integration before being sent back to their headquarters. The last category that we mention here is what we call the antenna. So typically, the very, very small in size, 1, 2, 3 people in a co-working space whose focus is really to be the antenna of the market. So to get an understanding of what are the macro trends that are impacting the world of reference of the corporates, and send this information back. So again, this sometimes is not black and white. Sometimes corporates have a mix of those. Sometimes they have an antenna that they call R&D, but just for the sake of understanding the terms as they will be used throughout the report, that's how eventually we categorize them. The first interesting point of reference, I think, is what Nori already mentioned, and what we mentioned as the main driver of why going into this deep dive. So this is an updated list and chart of, thanks for making larger. You can see some numbers of the presence of those largest corporates in Silicon Valley. So those are the Forbes and the Fortune companies that have an outpost on innovation with the definition that I just mentioned before, and divided by country. So you can see here we counted, this is an updated version, we counted 275 outposts of corporates. Bear in mind that some corporates might have more than one outpost, might have a CVC as well as an antenna, for example. So there might be more outposts than number of corporates. But just to get a sense of the numbers, here in the chart, you see the number of corporates and their country of origin, including United States. Clearly, those are the companies that are not already localized in Silicon Valley, right? So from the rest of the United States. And I think is very telling how Japan is way ahead of everybody else. So including the other United States, and the rest is 1/3 of the size of the presence. So you see France, Germany, and China really behind the large number represented by Japan. Japan, we counted today 72 corporates, 85 outposts out of those of the largest companies in the world. So very significant. Which kind of industry do they represent? Pretty much everything. And again, this is a mix that might be changing over time, as probably well representing the industry of Japan. Electronics is very high in the list. 14 of those entities and outposts are focusing on mainly on electronics. Again, this is not black and white. Sometimes it's actually a mix or more than one. Those are just the main industries that we associated with the outpost. Trading, automotive, IT, software follow, and pretty much all the major industry are represented. And so again, as you can see here, I think is a good representation of the Japanese economy. This chart, I think, is probably one of the major message of this research is that everything is really happening now. The acceleration of the presence of outposts is something that we didn't have 4 or 5 years ago. So here, if you just have a look of the increase of this presence in the last just 5 years only, 3 out of these 4 outposts were set up in the last decade. So again, it's something that is happening today. I think this appetite and also necessity of being closer to trends, especially of innovation and technology that are impacting at the core of all the major industries. I think is something that is relatively new, and the mix of the presence and the category of outposts is pretty much well represented across the years. Is clearly the last few years the growing lean, also because of the high cost of setting up a presence here, is the major one. So really the smaller teams are the ones that are mostly represented, but is pretty well distributed. And speaking of distribution, as we mentioned before, there are 55 of these outposts have lean startups, as we said. So small teams, typical small teams represent antennas or the corporate venture capital side. 10 of these corporates have, as I mentioned before, are present with multiple innovation facilities, sometimes with a mix of a CVC and the corporate innovation lab, for example. That's pretty common. Again, we're going to talk about the details here in the interviews that will follow, but this is just to give you a sense of really the setup. The number of employees, as we mentioned, is concentrated in a smaller outpost. So the 59 of those outposts have less than 10 employees. That's what you would expect in this lean presence. Where are they based? This is the map of Silicon Valley. So they're pretty spread out. So there's a good distribution. As you see, there is a certain prevalence of the South Bay, so in particular Palo Alto, San Jose, Santa Clara. That's where the Japanese outposts tend to be concentrated, sometimes also using the facilities of some concentrators. So Will World Innovation Labs is definitely one of them, as is Plug and Play. Last that we're going to show is, again, part of the study done by one of our partners, Dr. Martin Hemming here, is the flow of capital. Again, it looks a little small here in the slide. Again, you can download it with a few other charts. But what we want to mention, it is also the flow of capital that is implemented and deployed by CVC investors from Japan, is being constantly on top of the rest of the other geographies. So I don't know if you can see here, but consistently every year there's been a major presence, both in a number of deals that in the total capital being implemented, 28 billion implemented by Japanese CVCs into Silicon Valley headquarters startups. Clearly, by far the most prolific. The average range of investment is really in the Series B or C, so the $8 to $20 million, as typically as the co-investors rather than lead investors. Some of these topics will be addressed through the interviews that will follow. I think with that, I'll stop here. Again, if you need any specific information, again, you can download the report under manderbridge.com research. If you need any other information, I think here was also my contact information if you need to contact separately. And with that, we're going to take a quick break and we're going to resume real quick with the next Mind the Chat with the CEO of World Innovation Labs. Thank you. All right, welcome back. Let me introduce you again, Isayama, co-founder and CEO of World Innovation Lab. Again, how you doing?
Good. Good morning, Marco. How are you?
Very good, very good.
Yeah.
We're very glad to have you here. I don't think we could have thought and imagined a better speaker, I think, to really to recap it, to get a sense of where the world of corporate innovation, in particular when it relates to Japan, is going. So very happy to have you here. Do you have any first-hand feedback on the data that we presented?
Yeah. Well, thanks for this opportunity to start with. And I think those data are great. I think a lot of us kind of know that the corporate activity, Japanese corporate activity in Silicon Valley, became quite obvious, and with the big funds like SoftBank and a lot of corporate entering this area, we hear about it, but we never had a comprehensive data of, are we really a majority of the force, or are we one of small groups? And this report clearly shows who are out there, how active are we doing, what's the size relative to other countries, and it did give us, at least give me a confidence that there is a lot going on with Japanese corporate, and which correlates to the interest, how they want to learn about innovation and work closely with startups and embrace entrepreneurship and bring it back to home country. So I think all the data you show today are great signs and encouraging to me.
Very good. Yeah, so looking forward to go a little deeper. So let's start with a little bit of your background, because I think you've been in Silicon Valley pretty much the same amount of time, around 20 years. You went to Stanford here Business School, and then from there into Will. So let's cover a little bit of your journey.
Yeah. So what brought me to Silicon Valley was before I came to United States for graduate Stanford education, I was working for a commercial bank, now part of Mizuho Financial Group. And one of my mission was, how can I help industry thrive? And particularly, I was interested in formation of new industries. And my era was all about information technology. So as a banker, I said I have to figure out a way to learn what's happening in Silicon Valley, because it looks like telecommunication to semiconductors, a lot of the innovation seems to be happening across the ocean, and I wanted to have the opportunity. So I was sponsored from my company. After all this rigorous selection process, I was able to come here, got fascinated about learning about innovation ecosystem. And then, while I was supposed to go back after 2-year education, I said, I need to do something beyond just studying on case studies and textbooks. I wanted to be part of the startup.
And just to get a time reference here, we're the beginning of 2000, right? 2002, by the time you graduated from Stanford Business School.
Yeah, so I'm in class of 2003. So I started school in 2001, 2003. And as you know, that time, at least outside of campus, was kind of dead. I mean, it was right after the bubble. Startup was not as popular as today. Everyone was thriving for investment bank and consulting, but my interest is all about entrepreneurship. So I came here, learned a lot in campus, and then I wanted to go out and see the real world. So I decided to stay in Silicon Valley, and eventually started to work for one of the venture capital fund in Sand Hill Road, DCM. And I spent 10 years learning about venture. And particularly what was fortunate during that time was that I had an opportunity to open this firm's office in China and also open an office in Tokyo. That's when I saw, okay, what's been going on in Tokyo while I was living in Silicon Valley. And that really sparked me to think, oh gosh, I learned so much in the United States and Japan. Since not much has changed in the Japanese entrepreneur market, I need to do something to impact and change the way people think about innovation and entrepreneurs in Japanese society. So that kind of led me to do what I'm doing right now.
And I love when we talked before, your idea that was brought from the history of Japan, of the building a trading post, right, and poaching it from the history of the JEMA. Maybe why don't you mention that, because I thought it was particularly interesting.
Yeah. So when continuing the thought, after I worked with ECM 10 years and thought there's the opportunity for me to impact Japan, and in a certain way, you come up with a great idea. But the toughest part is how do you implement it? It's same as startup, right? Everyone has the same idea. Let's do this. Let's come up with this kind of service or product. But implementation, how do you create a storyline that resonates people is so important to make sure that your venture is successful. So I thought about this after, at least I spent 10 years helping startups. So I know what I need to do if I were to start a company. And the idea struck so if I'm trying to change or become a change agent for the Japanese society, I needed a storyline which would resonate with Japanese people, particularly Japanese senior people, because the constituent I'm trying to influence are the Japanese corporate management team, CEOs, a little bit older than I am, and also government people, which are also very senior. So I had to come up with a storyline which really can impact and make them think, wow, maybe this makes sense. So I went back to the Japanese history, and I quickly thought that, during, on 17th centuries, during the Tokugawa era, there was a period where Japan completely isolated the country for over 200 years. And basically, that isolation was to prevent, getting too much foreign influence, particularly Christianity. But during that 200 years, Japan became very, very close. In today's term, closed innovation style, where you have to do everything yourself. But one exception was this place in Nagasaki. They created an artificial island called Dejima, which was acting as a trading post for limited foreigners to come and interact with Japanese. And the interesting history about this trading post was it was such a small island, yet this was the only place where Japanese were able to learn Western technology and science. So that was a place where people learned about advanced medicine, tech. And I said, wow, okay, Japan this just looks like big corporations today. They're very close. They think they can do everything themselves. They kind of know they have to learn from the new world, but they can't. So instead of trying to open up an entire country, I said, let me build this Dejima outpost where entrepreneurial mind inside of the domestic, corporate, inside of the big company can come out and get all these new ideas and try to influence eventually the mainland to open up. So I said, maybe this story is much more interesting than me coming up to the corporate and saying, hey, let's do something interesting in Silicon Valley, which is a storyline that anyone can tell. But this Dejima concept, referring to a particular historical event in Japan, I thought the story is much more compelling. And so I used that rhetoric to start my firm in 2014, where I said, let me open up a Dejima for your company and try to eventually influence the way you do things, the way you think about innovation, and also help you connect with these entrepreneurs, which would eventually bring great ideas into your organization.
And obviously, I think the story resonated very well because, fast forwarding now, you're extremely successful. You have a very high engagement with a very high number of corporates. You have almost $1 billion under management. And you're definitely, I think you established a model that must be really something to follow clearly for Japan, but honestly for a number of other geographies where really the core issues are pretty similar, right? How to break down some of the natural speed that is typically not accelerated, and some of the processes that are a little bit too hard to break once you are in a corporate structure. So let's talk about will model today. I think is extremely interesting in the pillars that you build up, and maybe before that, maybe just high numbers on some part of the investments, and in particular the size of involvement that you have today with the Japanese market, in particular of the corporate partners.
Okay, yeah. So Will was started 6 years ago with the intent to become an innovation lab for a lot of the corporate. So one distinct difference between traditional CVC and some of the outposts you mentioned earlier is that instead of me acting as a particular single company outpost, I wanted to create a very cheerful lab where various industry people can come in and come out. And this part is pretty tricky because when you look at corporate venture capital, you rarely see corporate venture capital composed of multiple companies. It's typically run by one company or sponsored by one firm and run by someone else. And we see that all the time. But whereas my lab consists of 20 plus Japanese corporates, including consumer electronic, airline companies, automotive companies, retail companies, consumer companies. And I had to figure out a way how they can align their interests. Because the reason why this format doesn't work oftentimes is that people think, oh, we are competing each other. And I don't want this company to know your special deal because I want to take it all to myself. And if I had to figure out how do we create a lab, an innovation lab where everyone, regardless of where you come from, feel like they're getting their own, they're learning something valuable that is irrelevant to the competitors. And eventually these competitors, I was idealistic and maybe naive to think that I was hoping these different industry people would come together to start a new business because, the world is becoming smaller and smaller, and these industry differences is becoming meaningless when you see Google and Facebook and all these tech companies entering automotive industry and healthcare industries. I think and just thinking about this industry vertical didn't make any sense. So from that spirit, we are a very unique type of lab where we consist of various institutions. So that's kind of a little bit of background of why I think this is unique. And there are three activities I focus on. One is corporate venture capital activity. We have a close to $1 billion fund. We invest in startups, and why do we do that? Because yes, it is a very important financial driver for us to run a business. But when you think about corporate innovation, I need to figure out how do I feed interesting ideas? How do I feed the tech trends to corporates? And I can do that as a consultant, writing a report, doing a research. But we all know the best moment where people get influenced and when you see someone like yourself running a startup or the same live people coming up with an idea and implementing it. That's when you get so inspired instead of reading a report. And reading books report is interesting, but you truly change yourself when you see someone like you taking risks, trying new things. So I said, I want to use this investment as a catalyst to bring startup CEO and match them with our corporate partners such that they can get, stimulation and think creatively and hopefully act like an entrepreneur one day. So corporate venture investment, it's important. Yes, we invest in startup, but it was meant to be a catalyst to change corporate mindset. So that's one activity. Second part is we have a startup studio called Business Creation. We help these corporate partners launch new business, just like startup, launch business from scratch. But corporate has a lot of resource, so I think it's much more advantageous if the corporate became serious about, okay, let me start this business, but I just don't have experience building business from scratch. So our team would help. A lot of our team are former entrepreneurs who founded companies. So we actually work with our corporate partners to launch business and scale it up, and we'll observe, it will be part of it until it takes off. So that's the second part of business. And the third part of business we do is, because corporates, it's fundamentally how we work in a corporation is very different from doing entrepreneurship. We sometimes think that there's particular skill set, and most importantly, mindset needs to be educated through a particular curriculum or specific tools that Silicon Valley startups use. So we have a little bit of this educational program in Tokyo and also here in Silicon Valley, where we bring corporate executives and train them and hopefully transform them to become an entrepreneur, meaning an entrepreneurial person inside of the big organization who can lead innovation, who can try new things. So those three are core activities. And by having those distinct activities, we think we are much more than traditional corporate venture capital. We're much more than traditional, innovation outposts, and it seems to be working. At least this past 6 years, we've been quite fruitful. Our fund operation is very successful, and we're seeing new business come out of our lab.
And I think it's in a very explosive mix, and that's why I'm thinking that something that should be probably taken as a role model to follow. And I want to go a little deeper in the three areas. The part of the corporate venture capital, the venture fund, is pretty self-explanatory, but maybe some ideas of where you guys invest there, what's the typical size of investment, what's the value proposition, and I suspect is also providing an entry point for the full Japanese market, as we know, is a huge consumer market, is the third GDP of the world. So big opportunity for a scale up here in Silicon Valley that has option today to raise money.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, our investment, yes, it has to be financially driven, such that our team is motivated enough, and actually our investors, the corporate partners, they're not investing us just to lose money or for me to spend money and give them insightful information. That's not enough. So I have to make sure that our fund operation is profitable. Yet I also have to entertain these corporate partners that they're learning something from this operation. So how do I combine those two when I do investment? So the one strategy we take is that of the 1 billion investment, a little bit more than half goes into the United States, mostly in Silicon Valley, and the rest of the investment goes primarily to Japanese startups. For US, we focus in mid to late mature companies, so-called mid to later stage companies, where their growth, their product or technology is already proven, and they're growing, at least locally here in Silicon Valley. And they're ready to go to Japan. Like you said, Japan is the third largest GDP. And when you come to IT spending, it's the second largest country. So everyone wants to go to Japan, of course. But why aren't we seeing that trend today? It's always the language and cultural barrier. Japan is one of those few countries that the local language has so much value in terms of business world and these unique business culture, which for the foreigners, it looks almost impossible to get in unless you're Japanese. So us having half of our team in Japan and myself being Japanese, I said, okay, I can be a perfect, tour guide to take you to Japan, introduce to the right people, and get the business running at the right pace. So we focus on mature companies ready to go to Japan. And that resonates to a lot of startups. They were like, great, if I can get your tour guide and your team's support to enter Japan, if they had a choice to pick from 10 VCs, they would at least include us as one of them, because you syndicate with 2 or 3 VCs when you do a funding at mid-stage, late stage, and we rarely get kicked out. And this is important because you want to get into deals that is very competitive. But if you don't have an edge or a value that resonates the entrepreneur, you never get selected. And that's the toughest part. Raising fund is one thing, but getting into a good deal is another. And we are using this Japanese market size, the appetite for innovation in Japan as a hook to get into great deals in the United States. And so we a lot of the deals in US inherently is focused around B2B software companies, because that's, obviously 70% of the US venture market is somewhat software business for the enterprises. And that has potential huge growth given what's going on right now. I think everyone is trying to digitize everything, so-called digital transformation. And that's majority of the investment we focus today. In Japan, it's a mix from early stage to late stage. But again, the thesis we have is how do we digitize what is then analog today, including, let's say fintech. We still have to, in Japan, you still have to go to a branch to do particular financial transaction. You'll still have to go to the shop to buy particular things. But can we digitize these things such that you can complete a lot of the things you need to get done from home? And that trend accelerated because of Corona. You can't really physically contact people. This digital transformation just accelerated so fast. And that has been our focus this past few years. And Corona hit the world in a bizarre timing for us, but it actually helped, ironically, helped half of our companies accelerate their business. So it's we're living in a very interesting time. And I'm always thinking, how can technology help make this world better to overcome this challenge we're facing today, which is going to go for the next few years? And that would drive my investment thesis for the next few years.
Great. Yeah, so I want to talk about the future and the impact of the current situation at the end. Again, just to finish on the topic of investment, do you tend to lead investments, or do you typically require or suggest a board seat also to get an understanding of what's your involvement with the scale-ups here?
Yeah, so I joke a little bit here. I always tell my US team that we should become a best buddy for good traditional VCs in US. Given our fund size, we can try to compete with big funds like Sequoia or Accel or Lightspeed. But as much as I would like to fulfill my ego by competing with them, I know how hard it is to compete with these firms with legacy and a lot of networks already established in the Valley. So my realistic side of me says, we want to be a best partner for them, because they don't have expertise about entering Japanese market. And we could be a very complementary investor at some point. I mean, Series A, those early stage VCs are going to take everything, and we don't have a lot to add because the company's too young. But mid stage, late stage, when they double down, follow invest, and they're looking for a new investor add, I said we have to be there. We have to be one of those firms when, let's say, some Sand Hill Road VC thinks about the next funding on one of their top portfolio. They have to think, oh, let's call Will, because this company is ready for Japan, and Japan is a big market, and they do this the best than anyone else. And that's a branding and positioning we cannot lose against any other players, because saying, oh, I can help you enter Japanese market is easy, but really doing this and helping them enter, opening an office, establishing a team, generating meaningful sales, this is not easy. And I have to make sure I am way ahead of the competition, providing that infrastructure for any startup. So my strategy is to become the best co-investor. Obviously, co-investor doesn't mean we're going to be a passive investors. Some of our partners become a board member because they have rich experience as an entrepreneur in the United States, and sometimes the startup CEO demands that, and we'll be happy to provide any help. But we're not stuck with the concept of, oh, we are a VC, we have to take board seat kind of thing. We're trying to help entrepreneurs. It's always entrepreneur first, and it's not our ego thing where we look good on the board, or we look like we're taking initiative on a corporate direction. We want to be a best. We need to do the right thing for the corporates, entrepreneurs to thrive, and we want to stick to that position.
And we alluded to that. You alluded to that before, but we I mean, you're not really structured as a typical and a classic VC, right? So even the terms that you have are drastically different from a typical VC. So when you talk about competition to some extent, right, in the investment phase, but really the way that your structure is dramatically different.
Yeah, I mean, it's still the pool of capital. So I always tell people ask, again, are you a VC fund? And I said yes and no, because we're like a corporate membership club. So I always refer us as, think of us like a golf membership club. You have to put a deposit, and the rule here is that you get my deposit back after 10 years, and I can do whatever I want with the deposit. And hopefully, I'm always trying to make sure that I return more than you deposited 10 years ago. And that's the simple rule I have. So yes, the structure look identical to 10-year traditional venture capital fund, but the pool fund that I manage is quite flexible than traditional VC funds are. But we still primarily invest in startups, and we want to generate capital gains from the investment. But the kind of the intent and the objective of the limited partners, who are the investors of the fund, are quite different. I mean, if you are a traditional VC fund, all they care is about numbers and IRRs. Therefore, they will ask, again, just keep investing in great companies and just exit fast and return all the money to us as fast as you can. I don't have that pressure. So I have a luxury to really think through what is right obviously for our LP corporate partners, but also I can do the right thing for the entrepreneurs. If they need more time, I'm going to give them time. I'm not going to rush them to get out and go public or take this M&A offer just to liquidate my holdings. I don't have to do that. So that really helped me centralize my interest in helping entrepreneur first, not about, how can I be successful as a fund manager? I mean, that is important, of course, but I can always make sure that the entrepreneur is a first priority in whatever we do, because they are the people who are taking risks. And yes, we were providing money, but they have to be most respected, and I think they should be taking all the credits, not us. I sometimes thought that VCs are taking too much credit for just as an investor, and I really didn't like that. So here, I wanted to make sure that whoever is taking the risk, who are doing things, get all the credits, and also not just credits, but financial reward as well, because that to me feels fair thing.
That takes me to the other part of your business, the part that is also part of your name in the lab. So I want to talk about that a little deeper, because what goes under the name of startup studio, company creation, is the model that has been around for some time. I remember even the tech companies. I remember Yahoo was working on it for quite some time. Google itself is actually still doing it. And there's all different shapes or forms, but there's not a single model that I think has been extremely successful, to be replicated, like, YC, Y Combinator in the world of accelerators. So I would like to get a little deeper in your process, is how you create those entities, those spin out from the beginning of the idea, the involvement of some of your corporate partners, and then how you then decide to spin out one entity rather than the other.
Okay, so now during the process of meeting with entrepreneurs and understanding the tech trend, a lot of the corporate would take some of the information that they're allowed to share back to corporate headquarter R&D, and that chemical reaction creates some interesting action in the R&D side, where they start to say, again, we have this, let's say they have 100 new technology they're working on, and they have prototyped certain technology into a product or a service. Yet as a corporate side, they have to pick one or two to scale up, and they sometimes have to give up some of the R&D projects just because they were just not selected in the priority in the selection process. But some of these abandoned projects, I say, look quite similar to what's happening in the Silicon Valley. I sometimes say, hey, this technology and this kind of service is becoming very popular in Silicon Valley. You already created it, but this project was never selected. Do you think it's a little bit of waste of your money? You already spent some money to develop this, yet you're not launching it commercially. let's spin it out and launch it, because we have a great role model across this ocean, and it seems to be working in the United States. We should do something in Japan. So that, again, narrative works quite well, because when people get convinced, I can always try to say, oh, this technology is great, let's start a company. But that is not enough, because people want to, it's better if you have a proof that this technology or product has certain value. And the best way to communicate that is it works in the United States, it works in Europe. And that's when Japanese people get excited, because like, wow, it works, it's working in the United States, maybe it might work in Japan. So I used and in the old days, we used to call this a time machine strategy, where certain technology or certain business that is already working in some other parts of the world, I'll use that as a reference to convince Japanese corporate to spin out particular business or ideas they were already working on. So that's kind of the very important process that happens when I think about any business creation that we do inside of Will. So after that process, we go and we obviously have to pick some projects, these abandoned projects, because the corporate says, again, okay, it's free. You can take any of our project, and you can keep financing the project if you think there's an opportunity for business. And we often do that with the big companies who has a very strong R&D facilities. In our case, consumer electronic company has a very strong R&D team. Also, telco companies we work with, they have a very strong technical team in working on novel technologies. So we go to their R&D lab and select some technology. One of the early projects that we did, so we did a lot with Sony. Obviously, Sony as a big conglomerate, they have a lot of technologies that they bake, but they keep it in the closet because they cannot, they cannot take every idea into a real product with Sony logo onto it. So we took out some interesting IPs and created one company that I created. The very first project we did at Will in 2017 was a smart lock company. Basically, I just wanted to get rid of home keys and use my smartphone to unlock my key. And that entity, we use Sony IP to and run it just like a startup outside of Sony. And Will invested my fund. We invested about 70% of the company, and Sony owned 30% of the company. We grew the business for 2 years, and then eventually Sony bought back our ownership. So it's now part of Sony, growing the business. So one great success of incubating outside of your corporate. We helped them run the business. We hired all the people. We hired the CEO, and then bring it back to the parent when they think the timing is right. Second product we did very well financially was an R&D product out of NTT R&D. 3 engineers came to me. Hey, my project was somewhat abandoned. They said I can do, if I can find a sponsor, I can continue.
Sorry, those are the engineers from the corporate partner, right? So
yes,
entity that you
NTT
really
Lab.
had
There were 3 PhD guys from NTT Lab, very great engineers. I happen to know them as a friend. They came to us. They said, Ken, help me. I want to really finish this project, and I think I can commercialize this. So eventually we decided to fund it. Those 3 guys left NTT to be the 3 founders of this entity, which we funded through Will. And 2 years later, this business was sold for a few $100 million to another corporate. So a great success as an investment, and a great success case as a project where, an IP or a project spun out from a big corporation entity became very valuable after 2 years of kind of cooking, right? I mean, it was raw material when it came out, but obviously my job was to make sure that this become a real business such that it has a real business value eventually. And in retrospect, it only took 2 years from something zero to become a few $100 million, which is somewhat fascinating and eye-opening to me, that to really think how rich the talent pool and technical pool of big corporations in Japan is, we just have to figure out how do you unlock it in a very effective way. And the concept is, like you said, it has been there for decades, and it's just so hard to do this right. Sometimes it's just a, financial arrangement. Sometimes it's ego. Sometimes it's just market is not ready. But this one big success that we were fortunate to have early on made me think I have to figure out a way to do this more repeatedly, more frequently, because this is equally important for us to investing in greater startup and helping them thrive in Japanese market and US market. That's important activity, but equally important is that how can I shed light to these abandoned project or technology that is sitting inside of a closet, bring it out, commercializing it, and making these engineers a superstar. That's what I need to do more, because that's when average people think, oh, if he can do it, if she can do it, I can do it. And then this entrepreneurial, momentum would eventually, expand into the corporation. And that's when these large corporate can become very creative and innovative instead of becoming very conservative and dull in a boring organization, which happens everywhere in the world.
A bunch of follow-up questions there, because I think the example that you gave are very telling, and then how to scale that into processes that can be replicable, as you mentioned, I think is the billion-dollar questions. But today, again, do you have people dedicated to industry, internal people that are your antennas into the R&D of your partners, or is that something that is not structured, or maybe is dedicated by corporate, by partner?
Yeah, so one of the model I thought about is that the traditional model is you hire a bunch of experts in my side who can interact with these companies. Yeah. But that's almost like, look, you have this expert talking to expert, and you're not going to come up with new, creative ideas by doing it. The best way to come up with a creativity that you never thought of is you bring in someone. It's like an ultimate generalist who is thinking of something interesting. So who is thinking how to change the world for the better. Talk to the semiconductor engineer, talk to the telecom engineer, and share the big gap in technical understanding. Yet there's so many things we can learn from each other, and that sometimes that leads to creating these entities. So I'm trying to make sure that we have the right people who is a very good communicator, regardless of the background, and who knows how to inspire these engineers who tend to be a little bit shy sometimes because they're always working inside of the lab and they never see the sunlight, right? They're always stuck in the lab. Once their product becomes real, it goes to the sales team or the product team, and they work on a different project. So you need a good communicator to influence these genius inside of the lab and bringing it up and convincing them to become an entrepreneur. So from our process, we like people who are likable, good communicator, good cheerleader, to go to these labs, communicate, and share at least what are the issues and needs out there in the world. Like right now, post-corona, there's so many things we need to fix, so many things we can do. But if you're just sitting in the lab, you don't see that world. So our mission as a corporate lab is to share, here are the things we need to fix. And you guys have technology and skill to do it. We're going to help you. Yeah.
So on a practical level, so you go to those labs of your partners, the R&D lab in the headquarters on a regular basis. And so you have your cheerleaders, as you call them, to just spark the ideas. Yeah,
and it's not as tedious in a sense, because once you establish the relationships, what happens eventually is that good ideas eventually come to us. So we don't have to do this periodical meeting anymore, because now they know, oh, when we have a project that is interesting, that didn't get selected in this selection process, let's bring it to Will. We have like a second chance consolation match to get my product out there if Gen likes it or the Will team likes it. And we're just doing something simple. Right, we're giving a second chance to a lot of engineers inside a big corporation to become a superstar. It's like you're not done when the headquarter process didn't select your project. We will become a second set of eyes, and maybe we like it, and we might, and that project might be better because no one is no one knows which technology is going to work 10 years from now. And sometimes corporate decision is not always right, and I'm not always right as well, but we're only providing these more chances for engineers, people who are trying to change the world to, and we're trying to provide extra support for those people who want to keep doing it.
What's the rate of success of those that go through that process? I'm sure there are going to be different stages of, idea, confirmation of idea,
Yes.
involvement, but what's the rate of success of the ones that eventually get started?
Yeah, so success on our startup studio is quite high, simply because we already, like I said, from our process, we already know that there's a demand in the market. Sometimes it's just technically challenging. Sometimes it's just the pricing, the cost is too high, and we're not trying to start something new that we don't know there's a market. So the chances of the market product fit is quite high. So the success ratio is probably above 70%, and maybe 80%. But sometimes we just shut down the project after proof of concept. After we get excited that idea, we created a first prototype. We share that to a limited set of people, and we get a social reaction. I'll just say, okay, let's call off of the day. I'm not going to do a second chance. Let's do a new project, because that's what we're supposed to do. Whereas if this was a corporate, as you know, they keep revising the plan. They keep changing. They keep going, because once they start a new project, it's very hard for them to shut down. I mean, and that's the mentality of any project in corporate, because there is a stigma to shutting down a project as a corporate officer. But I have nothing to lose. I'm trying to do the right thing for the society, for the market. So if the idea we came up with didn't fit the market, we said, okay, let's not waste our time. Let's try something new. And so we have some project that we had to shut down after 6 months. And good thing is that we didn't have to spend a lot of money to keep investing in the project that didn't work, and shift the focus to a project that is working. So the success ratio so far under current style is quite high. And in my term, success is either we use enough capital and we at least got more back when when the parent company acquired the entity, or when we sold this project to other companies. We got at least some interest or return on whatever we invested in this project. So it's quite high so far.
And in the projects that are more mature, what's the kind of a range of capital that you deploy there? Because the arrangement is pretty interesting. So there is part of the fund and part is from the corporate that decides to be the co-investor.
Yeah. So one interesting element of this is that when you spin out the day one of this joint venture, the project, sometimes this entity has a sunk cost worth of tens of millions of dollars. When you spin out, the corporate is not going to ask me to invest that money, because they already spent that money. So we have a luxury to head start with a very mature technology. And sometimes we get those technology for free. Sometimes we get this technology as paying a licensing fee. When we use it, we arrange a licensing agreement with this parent company, such that every time we sell a product with this technology, I'll give you X, right? So it's very simple. The toughest part about funding these startup is it takes sometimes $20-30 million to create this technology, but we start with the technology from day one, and that's a huge advantage. So what I'm trying to say is that the required cost of capital is going to be significantly less than traditional startups, because we are already having a head start of having a mature technology. That's one. And two, even after the project is launched as a joint venture, the headquarter always wants to help. It's like your baby, right? Mm-hmm. They're gonna give us free access to their lab. They're gonna give us ideas. They're gonna loan engineers for very low cost, sometimes for free. They think this is a great way to train their engineers in a venture project. And sometimes these licensing payment terms are very favorable. They said, "Gan, you don't have to pay me. I know this startup is cash strapped, so pay me when you get the income." So sometimes we have a luxury to play around with these cash flow issues with startup. Typically, when you want to build something, you have to pay first and then sell it to the market. Whereas most of my projects, I have a luxury to launch these products or services before I pay to the parent company. And they said, again, just pay me back when you make money. And it's easy to say this, but it is so important when you're running a company to manage a cash flow. You're allowed to pay after you get a check is so valuable. I mean, and because pretty much a lot of the financing you do it for to gap finance these working capital, right? Whatever you do, it costs, you have to pay upfront to create something and sell something. Whereas I have a luxury to postpone the payment as much as I can, and they're allowing us to sell stuff before I pay, and that's quite significant. So our project is typically in single-digit million. I mean, it would cost, a lot of our project would have cost $10-20 million easily if they were a traditional startup, but we end up investing single-digit million, less than half of traditional venture investing, and the outcome is quite effective.
And not to mention also the rest of the other corporate investors have a vetted interest in supporting this venture, right? Because they play their part and related to the equity and the return of that journey. So very good. So we're kind of out of time. I would love to go going, but also for respect of time, we want to pick a couple of questions here and then kind of conclude with what's coming up. There is somebody in the notes here, real quick. I heard many Japanese corporate companies in the past enter Silicon Valley during the economic bubble and retreated as soon as it burst. How is the COVID-19 pandemic affecting their business today? What's your take?
Unfortunately, some will, just because their core business is hurt so much through this COVID, and keeping this outpost in Silicon Valley. We all know that the cost of living here is just ridiculous. So sometimes they have to cut back on the cost, and sometimes they shut down the outpost office, which is unfortunate. And not only that, we have this immigration issue. When you have such a huge unemployment happening in every state, including California, it's very hard to send people to Silicon Valley. I mean, they're not going to give you a visa and green card anymore. So there is a little bit of that economical issue and more of an immigration issue that makes it harder for Japanese companies to keep their operation here in the Valley. So yes, we're going to see some retreat happening. I saw that happen during the Lehman. I saw that happen during the bubble. So it would happen. And that's why I think we need to have some locals like myself who can keep going like this without worrying about, oh my gosh, I have to retreat my expats because their visa is expiring or because our headquarters is hurting. I can just keep doing this on behalf of many corporates, as long as they're members of a club. And I think that's why that's one of the key reasons why I started this. But unfortunately, yes, we are going to see some retreat. But again, given how much energy and interest generated this past decade, which is again in your report, I want to make sure that this this momentum never stops. I mean, it would be a big waste for our country if half the company retreats. I don't want to see that happen. So my job is to keep making sure, hey, yes, do whatever cutting costs necessary, but let's not stop the heat of innovation. I mean, innovation is important.
And the idea of having antennas is actually a very relatively small cost into an upside that is very valuable. So let me turn into the very last question, and it's more on policy making. I know that you also, with your experience, you're an advisor also to a number of ministries in Japan. What is your advice? We didn't talk about the empowerment piece of your business, that is kind of a more on the training side, but what advice are you giving these days to ministries? I mean, in particular, of related to innovation or technology development.
Yeah, I've been saying two things this past few weeks. When it's interesting that a lot of the politicians these days are getting used to doing Zoom meetings. So I had the luxury to talk to many politicians this past few weeks, and two things I've been telling. One is, please digitize the infrastructure of Japan. As you know, the government agencies are the most analog, species in Japanese society. And when you have a government agency so analog, meaning they still use facsimile and and seal, so they just cannot get rid of these analog process in a business, that eventually influence the corporate. So then the corporate has to comply with the analog process. But if the government becomes digitized, then the corporate can be digitized, and our society will be digitized. So I told them, hey, no more excuses that people still love cash. Get rid of cash, make every government service electronically available, such that we can truly transform our culture to be more efficient. And that's when these entrepreneurs in Japan can truly thrive, because if you have this analog process that is owned by particular constituents, there's so much we can do. But if everything is digitized, there's so much areas we can improve through the power of innovation. So that's one. Can you digital transform the society through this hardship? The another thing, just like you said, is innovation. If you think about amount of capital required to make big changes, venture investment is the most efficient. Building roads and streets and dams, it requires a lot of money. And I get it. Sometimes those, stimulus policy is necessary to keep the employment rate up. But the biggest return can come from helping entrepreneurs, building innovation. And you don't need billions of dollars to do that. We only need a small fraction of capital, small fractions of GDP to potentially create 10, 20% GDP value 10 years from now. And you should never forget the factfulness of how the power of capital can buy in the venture world, instead of pouring money into traditional industries. As you know, every country would try to help traditional industries to overcome this crisis. But not to say that forget all the traditional industry. We need to be smart about spending money. We can't just pour everything into traditional industry. If we can provide a fraction of that capital into venture and supporting innovation, that your society could look very different 10 years from now. So those two are things that have been
excellent. We do have the option now actually to go through that very junction. So again, highly appreciated your insights.
Thank you.
And I think congratulations again for the model and all the success. I think we're looking forward really to see Will also in the next few years. We're not out of time. So thanks for everybody that spent a good amount of time with us. Also, a couple of notes just to say that we will be doing a few more of similar interviews with some of the Japanese outposts here. So we'll have coming up next week, we'll be hosting a chat with the Honda Innovation. So looking forward, you find us in this channel. So thanks again, everybody, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.